And so this was this conscription of his studio by the U.S. military during the war years was an all-time low for him. And a string of bad movies followed, some of them live-action films that are just awful. And it seems like the whole thing disoriented him and sapped his creative energy, and he lost his brilliance during this period. And the movies never really recovered until 1951 with Cinderella, which is actually not a very good film, although it was critically well received. The animation in it is lackluster, and the story of Grimm's fairy tale is completely garbled. And at that point, Disney had really lost, he had removed himself from the making of his own films and generally delegated their construction to his staff, who didn't really know what they were doing. But then in 1953, he did an adaptation of his favorite book, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. That is one of his better films, and it's a pretty faithful animation of that novel. It's actually very good. But most of the rest of his films, Dumbo and so forth, are just not very good films. They're sloppy and kitschy, and they appeal to the lowest common denominator. Most of them are not worth watching. But at this point, the process of his creative energy was being sapped and drained off by a new idea. Long about 1950, he had become fascinated with model trains. So he was interested in model trains, and when he became so obsessed with them that he moved his family to a new house where there was a big backyard for him to create a miniature steam locomotive that he rode along the perimeter of his property through tunnels and over bridges and so forth around his property. And long about the same time, he was interested in miniature dollhouse interiors that were miniaturizations of vanished turn-of-the-century Americana. And he put these miniature dollhouse sets on an exhibition called Disneylandia. And then he began to think that maybe he could enlarge and blow up these small miniatures into a theme park. He got the idea of the theme park, I think, from the 1939 World's Fair that he attended, which was organized by Robert Moses, and it was based on the idea of the Tomorrowland of the future. And I think he got the idea of the theme park from that, of creating a theme park as a kind of permanent World's Fair, although it is also, of course, a three-dimensional macro-scale version of Wonderland, and also Neverland. He had recently done the Peter Pan film with Neverland there. And so he decided to blow up. It's always a problem of scale with Disney. He blows up his model trains and dollhouse sets to the size of a three-dimensional theme park, in which the initial design for was to be simply a giant version of what later becomes just Main Street USA as one quadrant. But originally the idea was to recreate Main Street USA as a three-dimensional construct. But then what he did was he added 3 other quadrants, so that the initial design for Disneyland is basically a mandala with 4 different quadrants. As you enter, you have, of course, the famous Main Street USA, and all the way down at the end, where the vanishing point focuses on the castle, you have Fantasyland, which is basically the world out of Grimm's fairy tales, the world of the fairy tales that he'd been animating in his films. And then off to the east, you get Tomorrowland with its realm of 1950 science fiction, rockets and spaceships, and then off in the other quadrant in the west, you get Frontierland, which is the realm of the Old West and Davy Crockett and all that other stuff. So you basically have, what you have here in the initial conception of Disneyland is this idea of what William Irwin Thompson calls in his book The American Replacement of Nature, the spatialization of time. So we've got these different historical epochs that are all taken out of their context and set right beside each other. They are spatialized. And this basic idea becomes the prototype for the American theme park, which has now become the signature American style to the approach and layout of cities anywhere and everywhere. Las Vegas being, of course, the charismatic example. And it's based on the idea, as Jean Baudrillard writes in his book on America, of the American escape out of history, because this is a historyless landscape now. It's a landscape configured by shopping malls, roller coasters, theme parks, amusement parks, and it's a world in which history does not exist because it's been spatialized now, like the articles in a newspaper that are set beside one another with no inherent connection between them, and these historical epochs set side by side, and these different postmodern fashions that are set side by side one another in a kind of melange of styles is a very characteristically American approach to culture, and it's very kitschy, but it is the basic American style, and it's configured here in Disneyland, which then opens, I think it's 1953 or 55, right in the mid-50s there, and that becomes his great masterpiece. Now the interesting thing about some of these sets that he builds, especially Main Street USA, is that he said that he designed Main Street to be actually smaller. Of course, it's miniaturized than the buildings would normally be in a real town. And he says that the reason he miniaturized the buildings is so that the person walking through them will have the feeling that their world, modernity, is somehow more grown up than Papa's was. So Papa's Norman Rockwell world, the small town that was obsolesced by the coming of interstate freeways and electric technology and the arrival of the automobile, which tore the small town apart, that whole world of macro-scale technology is meant to make us feel as giants over the small dwarfish world of our ancestors past. And that is exactly the opposite of the way that historical cycles in ancient history have normally been. If we look at the Greeks, for example, they thought their ancestors, the Mycenaeans, were giants. And they were forever finding fossils all over the place. They were actually fossils of extinct dwarf elephants and mammoths. They would find these fossils of these giant bones, these giant tibia, and they would see them as evidence that the people who lived before them were actual giants. And so they thought of their age as a diminished age in which technology had fallen, and they could only look up to the grandeur of this age of giants. In somewhat the same fashion as in the Renaissance, they were looking up to the Greeks themselves as an age of giants of which they could only strive to imitate but never surpass. With Disneyland here, we have the exact opposite mentality. It's the myth of progress, that technology is moving us onward and upward, creating a giant world now with our Golden Gate bridges and our Hoover dams and our atomic bombs and skyscrapers and jumbo jets, and it's a world of gigantism, which has inadvertently, of course, dwarfed the human being to the size of an ant. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why we have celebrities, because celebrities are a scaling up of the human being to register his presence as an effective presence within this technological world of gigantism, which tends to suggest that he isn't even there anymore. And so the celebrity, the drive-in sized celebrity visage, a la Marlon Brando or Elizabeth Taylor, is meant to scale up the importance and size and effectiveness of the individual as something that can compete with the gigantism of these new megalopolitan cities. And so that's part of what the need to create these celebrity demigods is hooked in with. So there we have Disneyland and the idea of the overturning of this myth and the myth of progress, which Disney wholeheartedly embraced. He saw science and technology as basically the key salvific force that was moving us onward and upward, and he completely and thoroughly embraced it, with possibly one exception, and that is that he saw that the automobile was detrimental to cities, which is part of the reason why when we look at Disneyland and we look at the perimeter, which is surrounded by the railroad, and then later becomes the monorail, what's excluded from the city, what becomes conspicuous by its absence, is precisely the automobile. And so the automobile is the other. It's excreted and excluded from the city as entropy into the creation of the world's largest parking lot. At that time it was like a 12,000 car capacity, and it was the world's largest parking lot. In fact, the lanes were so large that they actually had vanishing points along the horizon of rows of cars that just continued on forever. But that's the world that Disney excludes because he saw automobiles as detrimental to cities, and he wanted only pedestrians on the inside of Disneyland, as he did also for as he moved into his later years for EPCOT City, which he began to start thinking of himself as this godlike being who could create this city. So he bought something like 27,000 acres of land in Florida with the intent to create EPCOT City, experimental prototype city of tomorrow, which he never actually built. The thing that's there now is a theme park, but it's not a real actual city. He wanted to create a city of like 20,000 inhabitants, and his design for this utopian city was radial. It would be concentric circles with the skyscrapers and the places of work in the center, with concentric rings of suburban residences and schools and churches out beyond that. And when the monorail would actually take the individual in from the periphery to the center of the city to work, and then once the individual got into the center of the city, he didn't need to use cars because people movers would then carry him about through the city. So this was designed for this utopian city, and automobiles were banished from this idea of the city. They had to, where they occur at all, is in the underground parking lot, actually underneath the city. And he said here the pedestrian would be king. And Victor Gruen had a similar sort of idea at about the same time in the 1950s when he designed the first shopping mall in Edina, Minnesota, the Southdale Shopping Mall. in which he tried to retrieve the main street with the shopping strip and put the pedestrian in there and exile the automobile to the outside by taking the storefronts and turning them around so that they show their exteriors, their backs, to the world of the cars, and their interiors would therefore recreate the world of the pedestrian. And he thought this would somehow re-centralize cities, but they actually ended up having the opposite effect. They decentralized them and created each shopping mall as a sort of miniature city unto itself that created these edge node cities that Joel Garreau talks about in his books. These edge node cities, which are decentralized suburban sprawl with their own shopping malls as miniature downtowns located, banished out to the peripheries of these cities. So Victor Gruen had a similar sort of idea, and I think I remember reading somewhere that Walt Disney did read and study the ideas of Victor Gruen and derive some of his ideas from him. So he banishes the automobile, and that seems to be the only negative aspect of technology that he ever recognized as having any validity, that the automobile has a disintegrative effect on the city, stretches it out, destroys communities and neighborhoods, just as Jane Jacobs wrote about in her books. So at this point then, he's nearing the end of his life, and he didn't live long enough. I think if he had lived maybe another 15 years, he would have lived long enough to actually bring this city into being. He wanted it to have a population of about 20,000 people, and he also wanted to put a giant glass dome over the city in a final touch of megalomania to create a perfect environment in which he could actually control the weather on the inside of the city. So note that we have a complete reversal from how he started out as the mouse in the maze, as the victim of circumstances, to now the white-coated lab technician on the outside of the maze looking down at it, transforming people into mice that run about his labyrinth as he pushes the buttons to manipulate them. So he's had a complete transformation at the end of his life. He's moved from mouse to God, Cosmocrator, the creator, and he's retrieved this idea, this ancient Renaissance idea of a dome, a glass dome over the earth, with this idea of the city. He probably would have created this, and it probably, like Brasilia and Le Corbusier's city in India, at Chandigarh, would have been just disasters. So artificial cities generally don't work because they involve too much ratiocination and planning, and people just don't live that way. Cities grow organically, and they have their own sort of minds, and they grow like trees. They throw out a branch here, a branch there, apparently randomly, but it all coheres and integrates and makes sense on its own. If the intellect comes in and hijacks it and tries to plan everything out, you end up with an unlivable situation, just like in Brasilia. So Disney then reaches the end of his life, and he dies in 1966. And there's a myth that he was cryogenically frozen. This is an urban legend, of course. It's not true. He was cremated at death. Although Jean Baudrillard actually takes it as a given that he was cryogenically frozen. He never bothered apparently to check and find out that that's just an urban legend. But that sort of urban myth, though false, is nevertheless inwardly true to the spirit of Disney's life. I mean, it is a myth, this idea of being frozen so that one day we will await the time when technology will be sufficiently developed enough to come back and reanimate the sleeping being, is the ancient myth of the sleeping king. According to the Celts, Finn was a great king who was merely asleep under the earth, awaiting the day of his return. And similar legends attended the reign of the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who was said to be sleeping inside of a mountain, and one day he would return. He would wake up and return. This is implicit in the title of Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's work, Finnegan's Wake. Finn, the great king, will reawaken one day and return to lead his people in new tribal battles. And this is basically the myth of Disney being cryogenically frozen so that one day technology will reawaken him and bring him back to the world. It suits him perfectly. And it also gives us an example of how it is that myth begins to transform celebrities into saints. They begin to turn into demigods because people assume these things are true. They don't bother to go and check the facts. They assume these things are true. They spread out like rumor into the popular consciousness, and the people just accept them as true because they have an inward mythological truth that's more truth than the outer reality of the banal fact that Disney was merely cremated. And this is how myth slowly grows tendrils and vines that entwine around historical reality, and this is the way in which historical figures like King Arthur, for example, or Beowulf become remembered as mythical figures with exaggerated caricatured lives. And so that's a chapter on Walt Disney that I've written in the book, and those are the main points that I have to say about him.